Richard Moss, thank you for this interview.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Gilles.
In 1976, you left the practice of medicine after a life-changing experience. What experience did make you change direction?
Here I teach living in the present moment, and you're taking me back 35 years, 36 years, whatever it is. I think what made me change direction is something that lives potentially in every person, but it doesn't awaken in every person. And I think the symptoms of that something is a kind of deep dissatisfaction and restlessness and a desire to live really fully, which for me took the form of I really enjoyed doing emergency room medicine. I enjoyed challenging medicine. I enjoyed mountaineering and rock climbing once I had finished medical training. One day when I was in the emergency room, there was a patient who had been very belligerent, very violent, and there were armed guards in the room. And I came to him and I said, I'm going to try to examine you with as much sensitivity as I would want someone to examine me if I were in great pain. And it was not an effective examination, so I decided I would keep him for observation, and in the meantime sedate him, give him some medication to relax him. And as I was coming back into this room with the nurse who had the syringe of medication that I was going to give him, a voice said in my head, "You have nothing to share with this man except love." So I didn't ever hear a voice like that before. I knew that wasn't a thought that came from me. I didn't know where it came from, really. I still don't. But I put my hand very softly on the top of his head, and my other hand, not quite touching, not physically, his belly. And my hands became blazingly hot. I became very hot. It became so hot that one of the armed guards actually moved away from the table and opened a window. The other one sat down in a chair. The man just fell asleep. His eyes rolled back in his head. He fell asleep. And half an hour later, he woke up. That energy stayed for about 5 minutes. And I think the nurse must have thought I was nuts. But by that time, they kind of knew that I was different. And he was perfectly fine. Not only was he perfectly fine, but he came to see me afterwards and said, "My whole life has changed. What did you do?" And I said, "I didn't do anything, but something did something through us." And then I became really dedicated. I wanted to know where that came from, what that was. And I had already been meditating at times, and I had already learned to feel and sense energy. And I didn't get much opportunity to do that in conventional medicine. So when that voice spoke to me, I knew to just put my hands there quietly. So that was the first step. And then I would say that was a very seminal moment. And that was when I made the decision to leave medicine, which took then a number of months to organize with my partners. And I was I wanted to know what that was about. So I just started living quietly at home once I stopped doing medicine. And I'd get up very early in the morning and I'd read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I'd read different things and then meditate on them and go for long walks. And some of my old patients from the medical clinic found their way to my home, and I started counseling people one-on-one, just holding their hands, sitting in silence for 10, 20, 30 minutes, and then just listening to them. And one day someone called me up and said, "You're seeing one of my clients, and she's going through tremendous change." And then another time someone called me up and said, "You know, my client had this big ovarian mass, and she went and saw you and talked to you, and it's all gone. What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm just listening, meditating." And I got invited by this second therapist that called me to do a training, and I said no. And then 6 months later I got invited again, and I said yes. And in the meantime, one day, I was sitting in the backyard of a friend's home, and this tremendous sense of energy had come over me. And it was at the same time as it was almost as if the air was full of light. Everything perceptually was changing all the time. And being a doctor, I could say, oh, this is not psychosis, this is not an adrenal tumor, this is not epilepsy. What is this? I don't know what this is. But I had a thought, and the thought was, it was a question, who has known this state, this consciousness? And I got the strangest answer, which was Christ. Jesus had known this consciousness. So I said to myself, oh, and with the same intuition, if this consciousness exists for anyone, it exists forever for everyone. So what was this consciousness? And I began to do something very simple. I just sat there in this tremendous state of agitation, unable to sleep, and it would swing into states of terror because I thought I was being annihilated. And I'd say, this is a thought. This is a future thought. This is a thought that makes me scared. This is a feeling. This is a feeling that makes me think these kinds of thoughts. This is an emotion that's coming from the nature of the thought. Now I'm in the past. Now I'm remembering my life. Now I'm terrified about what's happening to me because of looking at and I would just keep doing this, hour after hour. I did this for maybe 2 days and nights, and then I was sitting in the backyard of a friend's home who was taking care of me during this time. It was a much older woman, a Jungian analyst, and she said, what's happening to you is a mystical experience of some kind, and I'll support you. And I was watching then in the backyard of her home these 2 butterflies. One was dark and one was light, and they were dancing in the air, and they landed on a branch and they mated. And then when they broke apart, the black one landed here. And in that instant, all of the energy became silence. All the agitation became fullness. And I absolutely understood why Jesus might say, I and the Father are one, where the inner and the outer are a single one. There was just consciousness, and consciousness was everything. It was perception, sensation, thought, and transcended all of that. Thought is created from this consciousness. Feeling, sensation comes from this consciousness. Perception of the world is a manifestation of this consciousness. And it's not that the consciousness is separate from the manifestation. They are the same thing. So I was in perfect oneness for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. I didn't have to move. It was just, every breath was the breath of being breathed by the universe. And then gradually I started to have to come back to the world, and did. And I've been coming back to the world for the last 36 years, or 37, however many it's been. That's how my journey began. And that's what I write about. I write about daily life, people, this deeper energy, this potential for awakening, what it means for our relationships, what it means for health, what it means for psychiatry and psychology. So it was a kind of death of the separate self. And then, in fact, one of the songs that came through my head at the time was Donovan. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain. Mm-hmm. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is... That comes from one of the Buddhist sutras, which goes, first there's a mountain and a tree, then there is no mountain, no tree, then there is a mountain and a tree. Which means basically, first there's the way you perceive with your ego, the objects of consciousness. Then there is the annihilation of the perceiver and the perceived into one. And then there's the return to the observation, the perception. But the perceiver and the perception are no longer separate, really. Mm-hmm. But the song was the subconscious telling me, this is what's happening to you. So I created a foundation that still exists, called 3 Mountain Foundation. First mountain, no mountain, mountain. And I began to teach. And when I began to teach, I was 29, and the average age of the people was 50. Yeah. And it's been the same ever since. That's kind of the long story, or the short story of a long journey.
When you came back from this sort of non-duality or the witness position, the day after, was it, how were you feeling to just be back in the normal day? And were you still in touch with that consciousness, with that presence?
Yeah, it never really leaves in one way. And there are ways that I can call myself back to it. It's kind of like a foreground-background shift. If I'm talking with you right now, what's in the foreground is my memory, and also what's in the foreground is the part of me that's creating the words. In the background is this, whatever you want to call it, silence, stillness, fullness, consciousness. And so all I have to do is quiet myself in a certain way, contact my body and my breath, and the background comes into the foreground. But the actual experience at the time, and I think it's important for people to know, it was not an experience of bliss and joy. It was an experience of utter terror for a long time, of being dissolved, of loss of identity, of loss of what I believed was myself. It was not myself. It was my ego sense of self. It was my ego self. And then that receded and became just, as you say, a witness to something else, which is what we point to when we say self with a capital S, or source, or pure white light, or consciousness without an object, or consciousness without a subject. The experience of nirvana, which means to extinguish or to blow out like a candle, it's the blowing out of the separate self, the self-involved person. And when I came back, I became that self-involved person again. And so I had to learn and teach him that he was really not the king or the ruler, but the absolutely essential servant of this deeper consciousness. And the other thing that is true is that the residual of that experience stays with me as an emanation or a field that affects people's consciousness, which is why I've been able to do this all these years, because people are attracted through something they sense. And not everybody's attracted. It's a particular individual that resonates. So it continues. It never goes away. It's the foundation of my life. It will never go away. It can't. So I think of it as it's just a natural movement to the next step of evolution. Most of us, all of us, have attained. Well, not all of us, because some people are still quite fractured, borderline, and psychotic, and there's quite a significant percentage. But almost everybody does attain the stage that we mean when we say ego, or the ego I, this place we observe life from. So we say me, and then there's mine. We say me, and then there's you. But the consciousness of both of those things is not awakened in most people. The consciousness that the I and the other are really one, which is why my first book was called The I That Is We. So I think that this next stage that awakened in me and awakens in others is just a natural next stage of evolution. And I think it also happens in other ways, like near-death experiences. Yeah. Mine was not that. There was nothing that happened to my body. It was a death of the separate self.
Following that experience, how will you define consciousness? Is it the same thing as presence?
I think the words are slightly different and interchangeable, and it depends on who you're talking to. You choose who you're talking to and what I'm trying to say. So to be fully present is to be in limitless mind. So the now is an abstraction. Okay, so when you say something like Eckhart Tolle's power of now, you're saying the power of this abstract concept. But what it really is that if you're fully in the now, you're not in the ego. You're not in a consciousness that's built on the past and then can only examine the future as a projection from the past. You're right in the immediacy of presence. So we have words like flow, and flow would be a state of presence or present moment consciousness, where body and awareness and action are all one, on a surfboard, for example, or skiing, or on a bicycle, or or making love, or dancing, or at moments when the poetry flows through you. So some of these are deep experiences, but they're on the more shallow side of what we might call the unitive experience. And now I've lost your question.
It was his presence is the same as consciousness.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Presence is the field that comes when a person is, their awareness and their body and their action are all one thing. Then there is a field, a presence. And if you are in that presence, it changes you. It will change your body chemistry. It will change how your cells multiply in your body. You literally transmit from your field a greater integration. If your field is integrated, it creates integration in others. There's no separation. The bodies are not separate. If you're in the field of someone who's integrated, your body will start to integrate, which sometimes means physical healing, or sometimes it means something else entirely. But then awareness is another word we might use when we want to focus on the experience the person is having of their thoughts, their feelings, their sensations, their perceptions, and their awareness of the perceiver or the witness. Then we might use the word awareness. Then if we're talking in general about the capacity for consciousness or consciousness itself, we use that word. But we're really just sort of shifting position slightly with these words. It's an important shift of position, but it's subtle.
Yeah. When one goes into the presence or into consciousness, most of the time, going from the ego to beyond ego or the witness, everybody wants to experience that, but there's a part when you leave the ego and you sort of just surrender to the presence. It may be frightening for people because there's a feel of dying, and really literary dying.
First of all, I really wish everybody wanted to leave the ego and become aware of consciousness. There's a myth, and the myth is that if you achieve this state, you are liberated, free. You've experienced the kingdom of heaven on earth. There is a certain truth to that. You are liberated and free from the anxiety of the mind in the future or the regret of the mind in the past. You're liberated from the ego in that sense temporarily. But most people don't want it. What most people want are the fulfillments of the world. And the fulfillments of the world are beautiful, some of them. I mean, to know that you have enough money for freedom of your own time is a worthwhile endeavor, as long as it doesn't become the center of your life. To know that intimacy with another and love is just one of the most beautiful things that can happen in a human life. I would never say to a person, pursue the unity of the one state and leave the world, leave behind love, leave behind intimacy to do that. I think that would be, for me, foolish. It's find it in the richness of daily life, then and imbue your life, this moment of living, with that deeper consciousness. But you're also right. I think if we study, if I look at my own experience, for example, and I look at what I've read of other people's experiences, there's a period of profound disorientation that has the aspect of annihilation, terror, the feeling of terror, of annihilation, of loss of self, of disintegration, with the potential for psychosis. There's also the potential in those times, because the ego is not only a limitation, it's also a defense. The ego is a very healthy thing. Witness schizophrenia, for example, where the ego becomes very transparent, very porous, it's not substantial enough, and the person is taken over continuously by different identities. You could think of it in the old consciousness, the old way we thought of it as possession, taken over by different spirits, so to speak. There's a very dangerous period when the ego is dissolving And before you really anchor in the one consciousness and then can hold your relationship to everything, where you run the risk of being taken over by an archetype. For example, the archetype of the Messiah, the archetype of the Savior, right? And I've dealt with many people over the years who, in their opening for a while, thought that they were God, they could help everyone, and they could for a while with their touch, they could heal. And then it flips, and they have to integrate the darker side of all of this. And that's where they lose it. They don't have the ability to integrate the darker side, which is where the fear of annihilation, the inability to accept feelings like powerlessness, to accept that the only true power is awareness itself, not the power to control the world. Yes, it's a dangerous thing. It's not an easy transition, by far not an easy transition. So, and that's when I didn't have a teacher for that, though I did meet a person who had gone through that state. And so in his field, there was a recognition of something. My guidance came from inside through my dreams, with that voice that said, Jesus has experienced this. And I was a raised non-religious Jew, and Jesus was not a particular hero for me. But just a month before that experience, I had read the Gospels for the first time in my life, and I'd cried, because something in my subconscious recognized that a very small fragment of what we call the New Testament is actually talking about this awakening. Okay? The rest of it is selling religion, making Jesus an object of a group of people who want to make him, the head salesman of their particular belief system. But deep inside that document is the story of a universal process that can potentially happen to everyone, and in some ways, hopefully will continue to happen. I know it will continue to happen. The question is, will we outgrow the ego before the ego becomes such an incredible limitation and destructive to us?
Because most of the time, books are talking about, enlightenment and, the beauty of it, but they don't talk much about when you come back. I know that because I had a near-death experience myself, working with people who had near-death experience. So there's a beauty of the music or the sound of the light, and then suddenly they feel that the light is shut down. They come back in their ego, and there's a period of chaos that may last for 2 or 3 years, depending upon how you can cope with that. How people can, because presence is good, but how can one cope with his darker side, his shadow? Not only dark shadow, but golden shadow. And the period of chaos after that presence, and how to come back into the presence.
Speaking from my own life, the majority of human suffering is created by our thoughts, and the way we anticipate the future, either positively and then lose our grounding in the present, or negatively and become frightened in the present, or the way we continue to interpret the past. It's our thinking that divides us from ourselves, and our heads are not our friends. When we're trying to build a bridge, when we're trying to construct something beautiful, then the intellect is a servant of, let's say, an engineering project. And it has enormous validity there, science and all that we've been able to learn with our intellect. But it's not, that part of us is not our friend when it comes to trying to know who we really are. And it is not our friend if what we want is the capacity for a profound recognition of the other that allows a field to be created that makes us each more whole and more alive. So for me, what I went through with awakening, my goal would not be to have someone to have that experience. My goal is that what I learned or what I understood about the nature of the ego, the nature of how we lose ourselves, that in fact where we are right now as separate self-individuals is a form of being lost, but a necessary stage of development, and that what's making people unhappy is we've been given a mind, but we've not been given a handbook for how to live it. So I think I can come from the place that I was taken into and awakened, and then through hard work and struggle have made some degree of integration, enough so that I can live a daily life, an ordinary life, with a great deal of, with the same stresses everybody has to some extent, but I hold them very differently. It's just, as the Buddha said, this life at the level of the ego is suffering. But if you suffer with awareness, then there's a redemptive quality to that suffering, because instead of opposing the other, you have empathy and compassion. And instead of opposing yourself, you have self-respect and compassion for your own body that suffers the consequences of our own mistaken thinking. So I think once you've touched this, whether it's through a near-death experience or the kind of experience of fundamental realization that I went through, you have no choice but to be obliged to help others understand it. And the point is not to take them to that state, but just simply to help each person understand more completely who they are, what is possible, how to change, how to free themselves from, to the degree that it is possible, from unnecessary suffering, which is mind-made suffering. And so those experiences are seeds, but they're not seeds as if that's what we have to get to, that's an end point. There's no such thing as an end point. We're in a ceaseless co-creation. So when a person who has a near-death experience goes back into the world, even if they're very disoriented, if they're true to themselves in their experience, they will bring something to someone else who hasn't had the experience, which opens a door in that someone else that was never there before. Mm-hmm. And so I open doors in people that were not there before in those people. I open a way of looking, a way of seeing. And all that is a co-creation. Now they engage their own experience in a new way, so they have a new experience of themselves. Or they have a new experience of themselves, so they engage life and behave in a different way, so something emerges that wasn't there before. And this process of ceaseless emergence, because something changed, is evolution. It's evolution of consciousness, it's evolution of life. And if we've touched the next stage of evolution, then every time we touch someone else, they evolve. Just because they have a choice, just because they can look slightly differently, just because, how many people, there was a Tai Chi, actually a very respected Tai Chi master in England who came and did one of my retreats. And then a few years later he told me, after I was with you, I went back, and the anecdote's a little too long for now, but the essence of it was he realized that in a place where he still had fear, the fear had disappeared. And so he continued to work with me for many years, because it was in the emanation that the fear had disappeared. And so we pass on this realization to each other, not as the experience you read about of Nivakalpa Samadhi or Satori or this or that. Those are like beginnings, and that's what my third experience all those years ago was. It was just a new beginning. Mm-hmm. And I've been now that awareness, that pure consciousness, co-creates with my ego. But I know myself now to be not just my ego, it's all egos. And it creates something that never was there before. And that evolution goes on. And I have enormous faith in that, enormous trust in the rightness of that. But I certainly don't think there's any end point. I don't think there's any such thing as a final state of realization. I don't think even realizing whatever we want to call non-dual reality is anything more than a new beginning, because there is no meaning to non-duality without duality. So just because the ego is a two, which someday, maybe through a near-death experience or the kind of experience I had, becomes a one, but if it only became a one, you'd be completely unconscious and there'd be no meaning to anything. So it has to become a two again. It has to become a me and you, an I and thou, a dance, a constant dance. And that dance never ends. And then you ask yourself, why am I dancing? And my answer is, I want to know what it's like to trust life as utterly as I can, which means to just go with the flow of life and fight nothing and see where it leads me. And I want to know what love is. Just like that voice said, you have nothing to share with this man. I want to know how deeply we can love one another and what that means for human relationships and what it means then for two people who decide to want to raise children and what it means for businesses and what it means. I don't care a damn about realization or enlightenment outside of the context of people engaging each other in life, and it's somehow stewarding this planet.
Instead of asking a lot of questions, it's sort of you're sort of giving us the essential. What you were telling, it's like the bodhisattva way, that's you don't doing for the people. You're just pointing them the direction. Then you develop the mandala. How came the mandala of being?
Literally how it came, I took a group of people traveling with me to India and Nepal in 1982, and I bought a carpet, a Tibetan carpet. It was weaved by a family of 4 Tibetans that were exiles from Tibet, living in Bodh Gaya outside of Kathmandu. And I was told that it had been made initially for the British Embassy, but the dye had run. And so long story short, I ended up with a carpet, beautiful carpet that had a Tibetan mandala, a very symbolic one, no pictures of Buddhas, just a petite geometric kind of mandala in the center of the carpet, which sat in the middle of my meeting room where I sat with people for my retreats. And I looked at that carpet for thousands and thousands of hours. And so I was looking at a mandala, subconsciously. So the word mandala, as many people don't necessarily know, it's an old Sanskrit word that means circle. But in the East, it's not just an ordinary circle. It's the way of representing in a circular form the movement from ego-centered consciousness to the consciousness we've been talking about here, this deeper consciousness, this fundamental consciousness, and then the reintegration of ego. All represented in a mandala, because mandalas are circles. They have a very strong orientation toward the center. There's always a powerful central figure, and 4 basic directions in the basic mandala. There are intellectual mandalas that are very mathematical, that are more complex. And nature is full of mandalas, like when you look at a flower like a daisy, and you have the center and all these petals coming out in every direction. And I was walking around on this carpet, and this is like, I don't know how many years ago now, 15 or more years ago. And and I was doing this in front of a group of people, and I was saying, there's only the present moment, which is actually a limitless mind. And the closer you get to the present moment, the more you and your experience become one. But the farther you get from the present moment, you become separate from your experience. You become the spectator, the witness of your experience. And you try to control what's happening, and you're constantly being influenced by what's happening. And I walked around the mandala and I said, and the only places you can go when you leave this larger mind in the present moment is your mind takes you into the past. So if you're looking at a clock, that's 6 o'clock at the bottom. Or it takes you into the future, so now you're at 12 o'clock at the top. Or it takes you into judgments of yourself. So we're over here at 9 o'clock, I guess if someone's looking at me, that looks like 3 o'clock. So you're over here at 9 o'clock. Or it takes you, in the judgments of yourself, judgments of everything else. Judgments of the other person, parents, children. If you make your body an object, you judge your body. Judgments of situations. This isn't a good situation. Judgments of your career, judgments of your work. Essentially, if you can think it, we make interpretations and judgments. So basically, there's the subject, me, the object, you, the past, the future, and the now. And that's the mandala model. It's so archetypal and it's so simple that it's just spreading all over the world through coaching, through NLP. And basically it says the stories I tell myself about myself create my psychological reality or my emotional reality now. The stories I tell about my mother, my father, my body, money, God, Republicans, Democrats, or whatever, the other political, that creates my psychological reality in the moment. If I step back into the now, the psychological reality created by those kinds of thoughts disappears, and I become present, aware, embodied, and I emanate this timeless consciousness, which is very healthy and integrating. If I get caught in the past, I'm going to have regret and blame and positive reminiscence, nostalgia, and negative reminiscence. And if I get caught with my thoughts too much in the future, I'm going to have either positive anticipation and negative anticipation. In other words, I'm going to look at the future with fear, I'm going to look at the future with hope. And that's where we live, at the periphery. And what the mandala being is about is not come to the center and have satori. It's about having the arrows in both directions, never losing your connection to yourself, to your breath, to your perceptions, to the immediacy of your experience, and be able to plan the future and aim for the future, and grow from the depth of your memory of your experiences, but stop interpreting them so they hurt you, your past experiences. No, it's not true that you were abandoned by your father in the past. That's just a story. What's more true is at a certain point in your life, your father left probably because he was scared or afraid or depressed or didn't know how to, it's much more complex than you were abandoned. But the story, I was abandoned, creates anger, or it creates sadness. And it creates that in the now. It pollutes the now. So that's the teaching of the mandala. Stop polluting the now with your me stories, your you stories, your past stories, or your future stories. Accept, watch, observe everything about yourself and about the world, all your judgments, but stay here in the center, in your body, in your breathing, in the vitality, and then start to experience this energy that is more than physical vitality, prana, if you want to call it, or life force energy, or the current, I call it. It's a current for me. It's a current that just makes every breath like just this enormous space, and the cells of the body just begin to vibrate so softly, and it has the quality almost of bliss or a gentle ecstasy. And I'm allowed to also have fear there. I'm allowed to also have anxiety in there. I'm allowed to have all the sensations that belong to the human in the world. No fight between them. But I'm not defined by fear, and I'm not defined by hope, and I'm not defined by regret. And because I'm aware of that, most of the stories have now long since disappeared. I just don't tell them anymore. Or when I do, I recognize the emotional state they create instantly in my body. And then I just I both empathize with this poor body that has to suffer my ignorance, and I forgive and start all over. I have started all over countless times, every day. That's the teaching. Start who you really are. Isn't the past. It's not where you're going to go. It's not a thought ever about who you are or aren't, or who someone else is or isn't. Who you really are is the awareness of all that. And you don't have to fight between them. When you see what's unnecessary and unreal falls away, the judgments of yourself fall away. The judgments of others fall away. And then starts to happen forgiveness and humility and compassion and patience and tolerance and the willingness to really risk everything for a future you may never reach, and the forgiveness of the past. So you start all over again, and you just keep starting all over again. And when I start all over again, what do I want to invest my life in? Whatever makes life better for everyone.
Could we say that this now position is an experience of the witness in us?
It's very abstract when you say it that way, and yes, it is that, but when someone hears the word witness, they don't realize the witness is sensual. The witness is vibrating. The witness is just so alive. A few questions back, you asked me about how difficult it is sometimes to integrate this. In the early years, I would go back into my ego structure, and then the energy would be too tremendous, and I would be just not only very uncomfortable, but very, very afraid. But then it would crack me open, and then my heart would be like a broken heart walking around. But if I saw a person and said a kind word to them, they might just cry on the spot, or feel like they were just seen as if they've never been seen before. And it was just very few words or no words, or just a simple comment, "Thank you so much for what you do," which you might say it to anyone at any time, but when I was in that state and said it, it was as if someone had just been seen like a child so hoping to be seen by a parent, you know. So I went between this closed heart and this open, broken heart, this closed heart and this open, broken heart, for years and years and years. And now I'm somewhere in between. It's not closed, it's always open, but it's not so open that it's so miserable as it was in the early years. And so the witness is too abstract. It's too abstract. This is passionate, this is sensual, this is... somebody that stays in the witness position has misunderstood meditation and has become a little too impersonal and probably is intolerant of other people's loss of focus, and is probably using their spiritual path as a defense against living life completely. So words like that I don't use very much. And yet you're right, in a technical, intellectual sense, it is a witness. But it is not separate from the body. It's not separate from sensuality. It's not separate from sensation and feeling and passion and fear and urge and yearning and love. And it's not. Because if it takes you away from those things, it's a distortion. It's a misunderstanding. It takes you deeper into life, deeper into love, deeper into connection, deeper into the feeling of the absence of connection. It takes you deeper into everything. And so the witness is literally the capacity to enter and join and enter and more and deeper and more complete and more vulnerable and more open and more accepting and more alive and deeper and deeper. Not further out and further away and disassociated and inimmune and no, I don't, oh, that's not real, that's not important, that's insignificant. Not in that. That's not what the witness is. Not in my experience.
Yeah, because it can be a split from the real life, you know. It's like living in full passion.
Jesus said something. I'm, again, not selling a particular religion. I can't help it. I have come so that you would have life and have it more abundantly. That's the English translation in the King James Bible. Abundance, though, is a Latin word. It means to flow like a river flows. I have come so you would have life and flow like a river flows, moment by moment. The river goes over the rapids. There's churning white water, you know. There's whirlpools, there's swirling, there's agitation, it goes over the waterfall. Oh, wow. Going over the waterfall is horrific. It's an aliveness almost unbearable. It goes through the quiet times. It's just sublime, you know. Flow is not this crazy notion that somehow we're going to be at peace and calm. It's not that at all. You just don't wound others with your own woundedness. Your own state of distress doesn't stop you from being able to listen with compassion and care. The self-involvement is the problem. At the level of the ego, if there's fear or discomfort or pain or illness, we become so self-involved. But if you've begun to awaken, you have all of those same things. You could be sick, you could be in pain, but you're not so self-involved. And so the other, there's room for the other, there's room for the love, there's room for that touch that never ends. There's room to listen in a way that never ends, to know that you cannot know anything that's fundamental or essential. Everything is the edge of the infinite. Everything is a doorway to something just beyond words that can be, to a certain extent, felt into. I love the Leonard Cohen poem, song in his 10 new songs. The one about love, and he says, "I'll try to tell you a little more. Love was everywhere, you know." And then suddenly there was an open door, and love itself was gone. You know. So for the Bodhisattva, love is everything. But then there is a place where love itself is gone, and it's not because it's the absence of love, it's because everything is love, and including our misery. And it's not easy to believe that, and it's not easy to live that. And you don't just have an automatic passport because you've had some form of fundamental realization or enlightenment. There's a whole lot that we imagine about spiritual life. That it's just basically an ego imagining a heaven somewhere else. But even the meditator imagines that if they meditate long enough in the right way, they're going to reach something. And the only thing you're ever going to reach is right where you are. And if you're lucky enough to reach that, sometimes it's a waterfall, sometimes it's a storm, sometimes it's the most joyous, beautiful, sunny day, you know. I mean, it's metaphorically speaking. And if you know that the things that are going to make the storms, more than anything else, are going to either be your health or your relationships with people. They're going to make the joy and they're going to make the storms, those places. So that's where the spiritual work needs to be done. My relationship to my body, no matter my circumstances, my relationship to you, no matter my circumstances or yours. And the other thing I would want to say is, spirituality is an invention. The words we use for certain states were imagined or invented by people before us. I don't feel obliged to live someone else's imagination. I'm going to imagine my own. Invent and imagine the world I want, the way I choose to live, the values I bring. It turns out they're pretty universal. It turns out that when others are made new, the world they tend to imagine has a lot of similarities. It has a lot to do with compassion, and it has a lot to do with wanting a world that works for everyone, and it has a lot to do with trying to release not only oneself but others from suffering and unnecessary suffering. But I think in our craziness we're trapped in the idea that what's been created so far is real, as opposed to what's been created so far, whether it's structures and architecture and the way people live in the city, and the strange thing here in Montreal from my eyes of a city in such a cold climate with all these outdoor stairs. You know, I mean, why was that imagined into existence? But then why do people imagine that there's such a thing as liberation through enlightenment? There's just deeper responsibility, deeper engagement in life, which transforms life. And that's ceaseless. That never ends. And that is not unreal in the sense that imagination is unreal. If you say my body is too fat, you're imagining that. If you say I'm not lovable, you're imagining that. That's just imagination. If you say there's a state called Satori and it's really important to reach it, you're imagining that. I mean, it's all imagination. And if I want to imagine a world that everyone is going to want to be in, then I have to not only think of that in terms of, let's say, the technology that might make that possible. I have to look at the consciousness that's necessary to make that possible. And the only laboratory I have is myself, ultimately, and my relationships, you know, and whoever wants to play with me. You know, my favorite American poet is Walt Whitman, and he said that the truest expression is that which, finding no sphere worthy of itself, makes one. See, now that's a liberated life. That's an awakened life. I am going to make the world I want through the way I live, which means the way I talk, and the way I listen, the way I touch, how you enter me, how I enter you. Everything is imagined. So every spiritual teacher out there they're just teaching their imagination, their invention, their co-creation with this one consciousness. If you only are one, there's nothing. As soon as you're two, there's relationship. And any way I decide to relate to God, or infinity, or the Tao, or the source, or the light, or the one consciousness, in that dance between ego and that comes this emergence. And it's endless. And when someone has a near-death experience, they've been taken to a new place entirely. So now they come back, and they are not who they were before. Therefore, every relationship, every sentence out of their mouths is either the old ego taking over again, or the new awareness of the old ego taking over, a new way of doing things. Same thing happens with what I experienced, which is probably spontaneous realization or enlightenment, fundamental realization or enlightenment. And historically, we know that that's how it happens. It just happens to people. And then some create a religion, and some create a following, and some become artists, and some just write poetry quietly in a room, and some are solitaries, and some teach, and some do nothing but just simply take care of the little farm that they have. I mean, there's no one way whatsoever. But what happens around them didn't happen before because something new is engaging life. That's how I look at it.
Your new book, Inside Out Healing, presents powerful tools and practice for transforming self-limiting of thoughts and behavior and live more fully the present. Could you tell us more about these tools?
Well, the book was my effort to, as simply as possible, in using many, many examples from people's lives, people facing health challenges, people facing relationship, separation, divorce challenges, new parenting or parenting challenges, anything in life where we deeply care and where we're challenged, to show them a pathway through that. Not that it makes it easier, that it gives birth to more richness. And it's very clear, it's very simply written. So it's a timeless manuscript or workbook for learning to live more continuously in the present moment, and to do the kind of healing that comes out of leaving behind all these stories and coming deeper into the body, deeper into the present moment. And it's my most recent book. It literally is a sequel to the previous book, The Mandala of Being, which was more the Mandala of Being took me almost 6 years to write. It was sort of I wanted to look at development and how we start and how we end up as an ego and the problems that we have because we're stuck at that level, and then how we can move beyond it. And I think that book really is a deep contribution to the literature on consciousness. And the new book is almost like, okay, if you're interested in doing this and living it, this will show you how to do it, step by step by step. And you don't have to you can relate to others doing it, so you learn through the examples of others. It has lots of examples in it. And in essence, it takes all of my work up until this point and makes it as clear as possible and useful, very practical.
How can one stop, creating or telling all those stories that we have in our mind, that we're talking, sort of recreating the world at every moment?
Mm-hmm. You can't stop. The mind makes thoughts just like the bone marrow makes blood. What you can do is have awareness of the thoughts and see the pattern, that there is a pattern, that the ego I or the me is constructed from a very narrow range of thoughts. And they're almost all, they are all judgments. Sometimes the judgments puff us up and make us bigger, and sometimes the judgments make us smaller. But the work of the ego is about being special. And we have to create some way that we're special, either special in our misery or special in our power, in our brilliance, in our skill. And there isn't any simple way to learn any of this, any more so than you could learn a violin without practicing. So you have to practice this awareness. You have to wake up in the middle of these stories, recognize they've taken you into the past or the future, or into judgments of yourself or judgments of others, and start all over. I can't think of the name of the man right now who just published the literature or reported some of the literature. It takes 10,000 hours of practice to achieve a degree of, let's say, mastery. 10,000 hours of practicing piano or violin or any athletic that you become really good at. Well, by the time we're 10 years old, we've had tens of thousands of hours of practice of identification with our thoughts and fear of our feelings, and believing our emotions, believing the thoughts that create our emotions, if we're going to change that, we have to wake up over and over and over and over, start over again and again and again. And we have to want to do that. Not just because it's making us unhappy. We have to want to do that because if we do not do that, nothing will change. Einstein said, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect something new to happen, a new outcome, that's crazy. So if you keep thinking, I have to fix myself, that's crazy. You won't. You can't fix yourself. Fixing yourself is the wrong idea. Awareness of yourself, without any need to change a thing, no agenda to fix yourself, just awareness will transform you. Wanting to be understood in a conversation. Everybody wants to be understood. Where has it gotten us? I don't want to be understood. I'm very curious about how you experience yourself. So I listen for what's alive in you, I listen to you. I don't care whether you understand me. That listening to you, and I don't care if I understand you. I mean, do I understand a tree just because I call it a tree? Do I understand a bluebird because I call it a bluebird? It's a label. There's no way to understand something in its essence. No way. So wanting to understand is an old habit, a bad habit. Listen, look, be. Something new happens that never was there before, and it always takes us toward something more complete or whole. That's my experience. It never has taken me into fragmentation and loss. It's always taken me into the oneness, the completion, the interconnectedness, the eros of things. So it's practice. You have to have faith in your practice. I think the Buddhist concept of sin is to know that there's a path that will lead you to higher consciousness and not to follow it. I think that's a good definition of sin. And the notion of missing the mark, which is more the definition of the origin of the word sin. We have a very punishing concept of sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Practice. Spontaneous awakening happened to me 36 years ago, and it wouldn't have meant anything if I didn't work. Practice. People don't want to hear that. They want the pill. They want the instant remedy. But the person who is a great violinist practiced. The person who's trained their voice to exquisite capacities has practiced. The person who really does medicine as a profound art has spent tens of thousands of hours to get there. There is no freedom, there's no liberation without work. And some people are motivated by suffering, and some people are motivated because they meet someone who is so alive or whose heart is big, and they say, I want to be like that. I want to learn how to be like that. But suffering is the big teacher.
Before concluding, could we go through the book you've written? The first one was The I That Is We. Because somehow it's your own quest, your own journey through that you share with us.
Someone said to me one day, I had a degree in medicine that gave me credibility, even though what I do doesn't have anything to do with medicine in the ordinary or conventional sense. It doesn't have a lot to do with it. They used the expression, he used the expression, the pariah of the unpublished. So I said, okay, I'll write a book. The first book was The I That Is We. When I had written, I handed it to a good friend of mine who had published several books. And she said, well, it's not a book yet. So then I don't know. It just was an outpouring of something. And I sat with it for a while longer, and it became a book. And it's close to my original time of awakening and the very beginning of my first few years of teaching. So in some ways it's my purest and most naive book, and there's still a lot of my ego in it, and there's still a lot of self-involvement in it. And each book has a little less self-involvement and a little more clarity about what the journey is about, and it shifts the emphasis according to wherever my life was. I married and had 3 young stepchildren. I had no children of my own, and so then later on I wrote a book called I can't even remember right now.
How Shall I Live?
How Shall I Live was about transforming your life when faced with a health crisis, the opportunity. And then after that came The Black Butterfly, which was which was the next stage of my understanding of this awakening that happened. And then after that came the book that I'm thinking of.
The Second Miracle.
The Second Miracle, which was really about this consciousness that I'm talking about in relationships. And then Words That Shine Both Ways, and then the Mandala of Being, and now Inside Out Healing. I pretty much have said everything I'm ever going to say, so I'm always just saying it slightly in a new way. And now I'm going to write, I think, what will be a really short book that will be about specifically what I call consecrated conversation, a way of speaking at the times of greatest difficulty and separation between two people, a way of speaking that creates a field in which people can heal their relationships. Because you don't get healed by what you say to the other, and it's how you listen and where you listen to yourself as you speak that creates the field. And when the field, well, the third presence in a relationship starts to get strong, it heals the people. It heals it opens their eyes to each other in a new way. It opens their hearts to each other in a new way. It opens their bodies to each other in a new way. And so, so much has been written about Tantra. All these techniques for prolonging bigger and bigger senses of pleasure but Eros is not just erotic, and Eros is not just of the body, as wonderful as that is. There's the Eros or the erosic world of how we create a space to talk to each other. And you're never going to heal a relationship just with sex. You're going to have to talk to each other, because there is darkness in us that we don't know how to share with each other. There's joy in us that we don't trust we have the right to, that we don't know how to share it with each other. And so I've been trying to teach Eros through energetic awareness for 35 years, but not put it into a sexual context per se, though I do sometimes work with couples at that level privately. No, this is about words, conversation that's consecrated, that it's words that help create a sacred space that hold two people and allow them to heal. And what we don't trust is that if we bring the dark part of us, the shadow part of us into the relationship, that the relationship will grow. But if we don't bring the shadow into the relationship will never grow. It dies.
Richard Noss, I thank you very much for this interview.
Yeah, you're welcome. I enjoy it. Thank you, Gilles.
Thank you.